Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get started and hopefully more people will join. Let's have a look. So my name's Ruthie and I'll be running today's surgery session. So it will be on situational judgment. So a lot of you who are preparing for the UCAT already, if you're writing it this year, you'll know what the situational judgment is and you might have done a few questions. So we'll go over some questions and then at the end have a Q&A as well. So just before we get started, a little bit about SixMed. It was a company which is created by medical students for medical students, and we've taught over 10,000 students in the past 6 years. Some of the events that we run are things like this. So the surgery webinars, which run every Sunday from 2 to 3 p.m. So if you want to watch the rest of them, just keep coming every Sunday. We also offer UCAT and BMAT support as well as personal statement support. Now this is both one-to-one if you want it just with one tutor, or we also run massive courses on how to write the personal statement and how to do UCAT and BMAT questions. And we also offer interview preparation later on in the year, so from October-ish all the way up to March, which is basically when the interview period runs. So we run MMI and panel interview courses. So a little bit about me. So I've done a few of these courses, so some of you might recognize me. I'm a fourth year medical student. I've just finished my intercalation year and I'm going back to my last 2 years at uni to finish medicine. I'm quite passionate about teaching, which is why I do these kinds of events, and my interest is in surgery at the moment. So what are we actually going to cover today? So first of all, I'm going to just introduce what the SJT is for people who don't know, and then go through some of my top tips for how to deal with SJT questions. Then what we'll do is I'll time you guys for each question and we'll do some practice questions. And then finally, I'll hold a short Q&A before we finish. And that will just be any questions you guys may have. I can go through those. Mohammedan said, how many questions should we get correct to get a band 1 or band 2? It's a bit tricky to answer that question because from being a student who was revising for the UCAT as well as now being a tutor for the UCAT, it's really hard because it varies year on year, because they look at the overall cohort's mark and then they judge how difficult the questions were and then decide what is considered a band 1, band 2 usually. I can't really give you a straight answer on that because I don't know how they mark it. So it might be worth checking in with the official UCAT website if there's a chat function or something, asking them, because they'll probably know a bit more than I do. Is this the last free UCAT webinar or will there be more? So this is the last one because SJT is the final section. So we've already done all the other sections plus general UCAT talks as well. So those should be available as recordings to you. But if you haven't got them, email admin people from SixMed and ask them for access to that. Okay. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Just make sure to mute your mics during the session. I think most of you are muted anyway. And I try and make these sessions as interactive as possible. So I'll have lots of questions, to practice questions for UCAT, so we can answer them together. And I'll also have some Q&As at the end, so then feel free to type in any questions, as most of you are already doing. And for the questions that I ask, if you'd be happy to type your answers into the chat box so that I can see how many each person gets right and stuff. So what do they do for students doing UCAT at the start? Again, I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I think it's probably worth asking one of the official UCAT people rather than me. I wouldn't know. So just to get started, on a scale of 1 to 4, how confident do you guys feel about the situational judgment section? So 1 being not confident at all, and then 2 being somewhat confident, 3 being confident but you want to find out a bit more, and then 4 being really confident. If you could type in the chat box rather than the Q&A. Okay, so most people between a 2 and a 3, and more people leaning more towards 3 than 2, which is really good to see. I think for me, situational judgment was probably one of the easier sections compared to things like quantitative reasoning or abstract reasoning, only because it's just scenarios, and a lot of it is trying to use your common sense and trying to think, what would a professional do in this situation? So I genuinely thought it was a bit, for me, I felt it was really easy compared to the other sections of the UCAT. And you guys might feel the same, or you might find it a little bit more difficult. So either way, I can try and help you guys by showing the techniques I used for UCAT, so that you can try and incorporate it as well. So the main things that we're trying to cover today is to understand the types of situational judgment questions you might get, and also practice these questions as a group. So what is the situational judgment test? So it's approaching various difficult scenarios, and they might ask you to assess the appropriateness or the importance of each answer. In total, they've changed it for this year. So it used to be 69 questions, but now it's come down to 66 questions. And as a result, you've got less time as well. So 26 minutes in total to do this section. So it's about 40 seconds per question, which is the indicator I'd go for whenever you're practicing your questions. You should take around 40 seconds per question. And as I said before, the types of questions you can get are appropriateness questions. So how appropriate is it to do something in the situation that's given, or how important it is to consider a certain factor in that situation. So those are the two types of questions you can get. So general tips for the SJT, I'd say, is considering these three things. So I'll tell you what I mean by this. So whenever you get a scenario, what I want you guys to do is ask yourselves, if you're deciding whether something's appropriate or not, is the response that they're giving in their statement, is that effective? Is it well-timed? And is it professional? If it meets all three of these things, then the answer is probably very appropriate or very important. If it only meets two of them, then it's probably appropriate but not ideal. If it meets one of them but isn't really sort of the ideal situation, then I would say it's inappropriate but not awful. And if it doesn't meet any of them, and if it goes against professionalism, it's usually the other end, which will be a very inappropriate thing to do. So that's how I would look at all my SJT questions. Ask yourself, is the response effective? Is the response well-timed? And is the response professional? And that's how you answer these questions. So let's go to a few of them. So is everyone happy with what I've gone through so far? Do you want me to explain anything again, or shall we get ready for practice? So if you're not happy, just ask a question about whichever bit you are unclear about. If you're okay with everything, we can move on. So I'll just give you guys a few seconds to type it in the chat if you didn't understand anything. No? Okay. So I'm going to take silence as everyone's happy so far. So let's start with the practice. So you'll get 40 seconds per question. And if you guys want, as soon as you found the answer, if you want to start typing it into the chat, A, B, C, or D, and I will time you as well. So I'm just going to get my timer up. Okay, so if I move this bit there. So this is the first question. So I'm going to give you guys 40 seconds starting from now to answer this one. Okay, so we've got a few answers coming in already. Just got 20 seconds for the people who are still thinking. Last few seconds now. Okay, that's time. So let's have a look at what most of you have put. So most people are saying A, and then one of the students has asked A or B because it doesn't really solve the problem. Okay, And then someone in the Q&A has said A. Okay, fine. So let's have a look at the question. So it says, Roger is a medical student accompanying two junior doctors, Mark and Amy. The two junior doctors are making fun of one of the patients in the ward. The patient is within earshot and looks visibly distressed, but doesn't say anything. So immediately, even before I read the question, I can see that this is a professionalism issue and we're making the patient feel really distressed. So it's going against the professional values of the NHS, but also of being a doctor. So it goes against the GMC guidance. By doing this, it also makes the patient lose their trust in the doctor, and they might not in the future disclose any information to these particular doctors or to doctors in general. And obviously Mark and Amy are behaving in an unprofessional way. Now the situation is asking me quietly mention to the junior doctors that the patient can hear them and is looking uneasy. The key words here are quietly. So he's doing it subtly and he's acting, Roger will be acting in a professional way if he's being subtle. He's also mentioning it in a well-timed manner. He's mentioning it as it's happening so he can stop it immediately, which is good. So it's well-timed and it's professional. And it's also effective because if he mentions to the junior doctors that the patients can hear them and is looking uneasy, they can stop immediately and also go and apologize to the patient. So it's also effective because it's also well-timed and professional. So as a result, I'd agree with most of you. I think it would be A, very appropriate in this situation. It wouldn't be B, appropriate but not ideal, because I think it hits all three of the things that we mentioned before. So as a result, I would go more with A than I would with B. Is everyone happy with that reasoning? So the answer is A, very appropriate. Yeah, yes, no, if you want to say in the chat if you're happy with my explanation. Yes, okay, perfect. So move on. So it's the same situation, but it's a different question now. So 40 seconds again for this question, starting from now. Okay, last few seconds. Okay, so that's time. We've got most people saying B, but then one or two people saying A as well. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. So it's same scenario, and it says, at the end of the day, mention to the junior doctors that their behavior was inappropriate. I would say this is probably not the best response, because if you're leaving it until the end of the day, well, it's not well timed, and Mark and Amy may then be going and doing the same thing to other patients and making them feel really distressed as well, which then further compromises the values of the NHS and it goes against professionalism. And also, I think waiting until the end of the day just prolongs the whole situation. So as a result, I would say I would agree with people who put B, appropriate but not ideal. So at the end of the day, he is still saying to Mark and Amy that what they did was wrong and their behavior was inappropriate, but it's not well timed, and it's and that as a result, it could affect the trust of the patients in the future. So that's why I would side with B more so than I would with A, because of the timing of things. Is everyone happy with that answer? Yeah, perfect. Okay. So the next one, 40 seconds again, starting from now. Halfway through now, so 20 seconds for people who are still answering. Okay, that's fine. So let's have a look at what most people have put as answers. So there's a lot of mixture between C and D. So let me have a look at this question. So it says, tell Mark and Amy's overseeing senior consultant about their behavior at the end of the week. Okay, so immediately the words end of the week is probably not ideal because it's prolonging the situation and therefore it's not well timed. By telling Mark and Amy's overseeing consultant without first speaking to Mark and Amy, we're not solving the root of the problem, therefore it's not effective. And we're also, Roger in this scenario is escalating the situation when he can simply solve it by just speaking to Mark and Amy first. And then if they do it, if he sees them doing it again, then it would be more appropriate to go and speak to their overseeing senior consultant, because Mark and Amy aren't listening to him and they're still damaging the professionalism and the values of professionalism. But doing it straight away, going to the senior consultant straight away, is not professional on Roger's part. And it's also escalation when it's not needed. So it's not well timed, it's not professional, and it's not effective because they're not solving the root of the problem. So as a result, I would side with people who said D, very inappropriate, rather than people who said C. Does that make sense? Yeah, perfect. So one thing that will help you guys answer these questions, especially deciding between A and B or between C and D when you decide whether something's appropriate or inappropriate, is looking through the GMC guidance to good medical practice for doctors. And it's a very short booklet online with loads of bullet points of how to act professionally as a doctor. It will take you probably about 30 minutes to 40 minutes to read the whole document. And that basically helps you answer all the questions in the situational judgment, because it tells you when to escalate, when not to escalate, what to do in different types of situations with your co-workers, with patients, if you're a medical student with other medical students, or if you're a medical student with other doctors, how to behave and how to escalate things. So I would say read that document, and that should help you answer these questions. Okay, and then this one. So again, 40 seconds for everyone. Okay, last 10 seconds for people who are still thinking of their answer. Okay, that's time. Most people saying D. Okay, most people agreeing with D is the answer. Perfect. Before I have a look at this one, I'm just going to check the Q&A because I've got a few questions. So we've got Mohammed said, do you have the document PDF? I do, so I can share the link with you at the end. If you just bear with me until the end of the session, I've got a slide with the link on it. If not, I'll try and find it for you guys online and then send you the link. So I will send that. Just someone remind me at the end if I forget. So audibly lecture Mark and Amy about how unprofessional and upsetting their behavior is. Most people said D, which is correct. Can somebody explain to me why they picked D as the answer? You can just type it in the chat, or if you want to, you can unmute yourself, whichever you prefer. If you can just say in a few words or bullet points why you picked D compared to C. Thinking about the three things we talked about: professionalism, is it well timed, is it effective? Yeah, again, it's escalatory when it's not needed. It's not effective because you're creating more of a drama than there should be, and the patient may even lose trust in you as the medical student. It's also unprofessional. Yes, that's a really good point, because again, it's creating unnecessary drama when there shouldn't be. And to be honest, it's a bit unprofessional because he should really be taking them into a quiet area to discuss it. So yeah, perfect. Okay, so this is a different scenario. Again, 40 seconds for you guys to answer the question, starting from now. Just for people's reference, appendicectomy is removing the appendix, if anyone didn't know. And then when you're ready, if you want to start putting in your answers, about 5 seconds left. Okay, that's time. Shannon, you raised your hand. Did you have a question? Okay, most people saying A. Okay. Shannon, if you wanted to type the question in the chat, or if it was a mistake, then don't worry about it. So A, perfect. So let's have a look. Call the surgical registrar on call as soon as you can. Yeah, so the situation says a patient called Roshan is due for an appendicectomy tomorrow at 9 a.m. Dr. Aki was performing routine checks on the patient before the operation tomorrow and realized the team haven't checked a vital component of the patient's health, which could affect the operation. The lab is currently closed and it will open tomorrow at 10 a.m., so an hour after the operation starts, and therefore bloods can't be analyzed before the operation. So number one, call the surgical registrar on call as soon as you can. I think this is really well timed because obviously they've recognized an issue with the situation. So trying to rectify it as soon as possible by calling the surgical registrar is useful, and picking the person who's on call is probably useful because they will be in hospital, they will have been following up the patient, so they will know what's going on with them. So they'll probably be the best person to call. So it's well timed and it's effective, and it's also professional because we're speaking about the situation to the right person. So A would be correct. So well done for people who put A. Mohammed, wasn't the previous question effective? Audibly lecture Mark and Amy about how unprofessional and upsetting their behavior is. I don't think it is effective because you're doing it in front of the patient, and actually it could make the patient lose trust in the profession even more because Roger is behaving unprofessionally, and therefore they may not want to disclose any information they have if they do speak to either Roger or Mark and Amy in the future, just because of the way they've acted. Like audibly lecturing is basically another way of saying shouting at Mark and Amy in front of other people. In order to be professional, one of the things that you need to do is also be subtle in the way you deal with difficult situations. And that would be to take them into a private room and speak about what happened, rather than, or obviously whisper it to them and say to them, you need to stop now and then discuss it later. So I don't think this is actually effective. Hopefully that answered your question. Yeah, so as someone said, it isn't like to actually solve the problem, just inflame it. Yeah, exactly. So call surgical restaurant. So that is A, so well done to everyone, very appropriate. Next one, so same scenario, but different question. Okay, halfway there for anyone else who's still thinking of their answer. Okay, that's time. So let's see what you guys have put down. Okay, most people saying D. So reschedule Roshan's operation for the next day, but don't inform him while doing so. Can someone who put down their answer as D explain why they've decided D rather than C? Why do you think it's very inappropriate? So Eli says patient safety, yeah. So reschedule Roshan's operation for the next day, but don't inform him while doing so. Does anyone know what happens before a surgery? Why this is a really bad thing that if you don't inform him, why could that be a really bad thing for the patient? may have consequences for his health. So Laxia, I think you're on the right track. You should always put the patient first. Yeah, good. Patient should be involved. Consent needed. Yeah, consent is a big issue as well. A little bit more of a practical issue. Has anyone ever had a surgery before? Do you know what happens for 24 hours before? Yeah, exactly, Bruno. The patients don't eat 24 hours before. So then saying to him, you're going to reschedule his operation for the day after, that will mean that he has to fast another 24 hours again. And they'll be really, really frustrated. And obviously they'll feel really weak as well, which is not good right before surgery. So yeah, exactly. So, and it's unprofessional as well for you not to inform them. What was the answer if they did inform him? So if he was reschedule Roshan's operation for the next day, and if they did inform him, I would say it's B, appropriate but not ideal, because it's still not the best situation and the patient may still feel a bit sort of abandoned, I guess, that the checks weren't done properly in the beginning. So it's still bad, but it's not, it's at least it's better to tell him and then obviously speak to him about it and explain why this has happened. And then rescheduling is better than not informing him at all. I would say B is the answer rather than A in that situation. But for this one, it's D. Oh, someone's asked another question. When discerning the answer, do we only use data that we get in the statement or do we make inferences? So with any UCAT question, you should only be using the data that you get in the statement. You shouldn't be making inferences. For this one, I guess the reason why I asked you guys what would happen if he doesn't inform him, and then talking through the fact that they fast for 24 hours is just to get you thinking about why it's very inappropriate as opposed to inappropriate but not awful. But usually just use the information that you've been given to answer them. And also remember that the NHS, like any other customer service role, it is a customer service role because we're providing healthcare service to people. So if you've ever worked in a customer service role, you know that if, for example, in the previous one, in the previous situation, if you're audibly shouting at one of your co-workers about how unprofessional they're behaving in front of your customers, is that an appropriate thing to do? Same thing in a healthcare setting. So thinking about it that way can help as well to answer these questions. Okay, next one. So this is a different scenario. So 40 seconds again. I'm just going to get the timer started. So 40 seconds from now. Okay, halfway there for anyone who hasn't put down an answer yet. Okay. Okay, so most people saying A. Nicola, sorry, is it asking how important this is for Joe or Anna? So this would be, so in this situation, Anna's the one who's determining all of these responses. So is the question would be, sorry, I missed that out in this. So it should say, how important is it for Anna to consider each of these things? The fact that Joe has been asked to carry out a difficult procedure today. So it's from Anna's perspective. Sorry, Nicola, should have made that clear. So yeah, most people saying A. If I just wait a few more seconds for other people. Okay, fine. So yeah, the answer is A in this situation because he's been asked to carry out a difficult procedure today. And we know from the information given that he's extremely hungover, he could be making mistakes, which could then compromise patient safety. So, and the fact that he feels drunk, again, it could be, you know, slip up of something. If he's taking bloods, he could miss the vein and then he could cause more harm, which again, then loses trust between the doctor and the patient or the medical student and the patient. And then it puts professionalism at risk. So the fact that he has been asked to carry a difficult procedure today is a very important factor for Anna to consider in this situation. So the answer is A. Next one, 40 seconds again. Okay, halfway there for people who haven't responded yet. Yeah, okay, so let's have a look at the answers. Most people, again, saying A, it's really important to consider. So the statement says the medical school issued strict rules at the start of the year prohibiting students from being under the influence of alcohol or illegal drugs whilst on duty. Okay, for someone who put A, can you explain why you put A as opposed to B? Can anyone explain? The answer is A, but why did you guys think it was A? So Luckman says it's breaking the rules outlined by the medical school. This infringement can get them investigated. Yeah, perfect. Asha, following rules set by the school. Yeah, Anna still has a moral responsibility to remind Joe to adhere to the rules. Yeah, well done, Nicola. And then somebody else said it would be unprofessional to ignore medical school's instructions. Yeah, perfect. Good. All really good thoughts. And then next one, 40 seconds again. Halfway there. We've got lots of people deciding between D or C. Just give a few more seconds to people who are still answering. Okay, so that's 40 seconds. So we've got a mixture of C's and D's. So it says several other students are in a similar state to Joe. So there are several other students might also be extremely hungover and they may still feel drunk as well. So that's what that statement is saying. So yes, that's probably a bad thing because those students could be a risk to other patients. But in this situation, Anna is specific, and with the statements that you're being given, Anna is considering Joe specifically, not the other students. So although it's slightly important to think about the fact that the other students might also be in a similar state to Joe, in this situation where Anna is specifically focusing on Joe rather than the others. So as a result, I would say of minor importance rather than not important at all, because it's still important because those students could go and, you know, speak to patients or take blood from patients and things like that. And that they may make mistakes because they're not thinking properly and they're not concentrating. But I wouldn't say it's not important at all because they still pose a slight danger to the safety of patients. So I would go with C as opposed to D. Does everyone understand my reasoning for that? If not, I'll go over it again. Okay, perfect. So, okay, so one person said, two people saying no. Okay, so let me go over that again. So we've got other students are in a similar state to Joe. With situational judgment questions, the clinical STEM, which is basically this bit paragraph here, is specifically focusing on Joe. So the general rule is if they're talking about Joe, then for Anna to consider the importance of different factors, she's only considering about Joe. At the same time, it is important to look at the other students because if they're in a similar state to Joe, meaning they're extremely hungover and they haven't slept all night, or they are also feeling drunk, similar to Joe, they may not be concentrating properly if they're on the wards, which can then lead to compromising patient safety. So while it's slightly important to consider those other students, it's not like the biggest thing for Anna to consider at the moment. So as a result, I would go with C as opposed to D. Does that make sense? Because there is still some importance, because if the other students are in that same state, that could compromise patient safety. But at the moment, Joe is Anna's priority, not the others. So that's why it would be C as opposed to D. Why not B? So several other students are in a similar state to Joe, because in this clinical STEM, as I just said, they're focusing on Joe and not the others, if that makes sense. And we've also not been given information on whether those students are in hospital or if they're back home, so we can't make assumptions. So it would be C as opposed to D or B. Okay. Next one. So it's the same clinical STEM, just a different question. So 40 seconds again. Okay, you're halfway there for anyone who's still thinking of their answers. Okay, so let's see what you guys have put. So most people are saying D as well, good. So Joe's made a bet with another student this morning that he won't be disciplined for being in the state. So this it's not really an important factor for Anna to consider at all. It doesn't matter whether he's made a bet or not, that he won't be disciplined. That's not an important factor to consider at all. So most of you are correct, well done. And then the last one of this scenario, 40 seconds again. Okay, we're halfway there for anybody still thinking of their answers. This one is a bit of a difficult one, so I will explain it in a bit. Okay, that's time. So we have a mixture of answers, okay? So keeping the information Joe has disclosed between them to maintain confidentiality. Okay, so before I go into what the answer is, when can we maintain confidentiality and when can we break it? Does anyone know? When can we break confidentiality specifically? Yeah, it can be broken in life-threatening situations. If it can be broken if it's a risk to patient safety, it can be broken if it's a risk to the public, or it can be broken if it's a risk to the patient themselves. So can you break it if it means someone else would be at risk? Yes, you can. Yeah, between patients in general, to maintain the doctor-patient relationship and the trust within it, you do maintain confidentiality, and that's a legal thing that you have to do as a healthcare professional. But if it puts the patients themselves at risk, if it puts immediate family members or people they know at risk or the general public, then you would have to break it. And in this situation, I know Joe's not a patient, but just using those rules to apply to this one, keeping the information Joe has disclosed between them to maintain confidentiality, I think in this situation, it's okay to break confidentiality because Joe is extremely hungover and feels drunk. So because he might compromise patient safety, which is much more important, it would be fine to break confidentiality and speak about this information with someone senior. So I would say, again, this is D. Maintaining confidentiality is not important in this situation. So does everyone understand how I came up with that answer? Perfect. Okay. So those are all the questions. So those are the kinds of questions you can get. You get about 2/3 of your questions, which will be in appropriateness questions, like the first few we went over, and then 1/3 of your questions, which will be importance questions, like the last one we just went over now. So the thing I would say is read the GMC guidance to a good doctor, and I will send in the link in just a few minutes. Remember the 3 things when you're answering appropriateness questions. So is it timely, is it effective, and is the response professional as well? And usually go with your gut, because with situational judgment, it's a lot about common sense, and it's also about, in general, if you look at a scenario like this and see keeping the information just close between them to maintain confidentiality, for example, you can see that in the situation, maintaining confidentiality is actually going to do more harm than good in the, during the day for these patients, potentially, if Joe then goes on to help out on the wards. So just using your common sense can actually help you get most of the marks for this. And then having a read of this document here can also help get you those top marks, either band 1 or band 2. But let me just, if I just stop sharing for 1 second, what I'm going to do is get the that link up for you guys so I can post it in the chat. So just give me a few seconds. If you have any questions in the meantime, post them in the chat, and then I'll get around to answering them in a second. So it's called The Good Medical Practice. I can actually share my screen and show you guys. I think I might have shown a few of you if you came to the one of my previous talks, but just give me a second. Can you guys see that? This page here. I've just got, so someone say yes or no in the chat. Yeah, perfect. So this is the website, the GMC website, and it's called the Good Medical Practice Guidelines. And basically, if I move this bit over here, you can see on the index in this right-hand corner, you've got duties of a doctor, professionalism and action, and then you've got 4 domains. So the first one is knowledge, skills, and performance. The second one is safety and quality. The third one is communication, partnership, and teamwork. And then the 4th one is maintaining trust. So in total, it's about 67 pages, and they're all bullet pointed, similar to what you can see on the left here. And if I just click on one of them, if I just click on respond to risk of patient safety or something, it just tells you must take prompt action if you think patient safety is or may seriously be compromised. And then it gives you the types of scenarios where you would do that. You don't have to read it all. I would say probably duties of a doctor section is quite good. And then looking through the safety and quality bit is probably useful as well. And looking at communication, and then the maintaining trust bit is useful for answering SJT questions. This first one here, yeah, it is important, but it's probably self-explanatory. It's like keeping up to date with your knowledge and your skills and things like that. So yeah, they're really, really short pages. You can just go through those in your own time. I'm just going to copy and paste the link. I'm going to stop sharing. So just give me 2 seconds. And if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat and I'll try and answer them. Because we've just got a Q&A session now. So I've just sent the link into the chat. So before I go on to the Q&A stuff, so on a scale of 1 to 4, guys, same question as before. How confident do you guys feel now about the situational judgment, if you want to post in your answers? Great. Okay, while you guys are doing that, so Mohammed, for the previous question, call the registrar if the doctor could have only a junior doctor or person without that high responsibility of patient care, the answer would have been A. I don't know what you're trying to say. If the doctor could have only called a junior doctor or someone without that high responsibility of the patient's care, the answer would have been A. let me go back to that question because I don't know which bit you're referring to. I think if it was that they would say it in the clinical stem, that they don't have, that they're not able to call the surgical registrar on call, but usually that doesn't happen because the whole point that a surgical registrar is on call is for these emergency situations, and we always have an on-call registrar or an on-call doctor, because that's how surgery runs in general, because they're always someone on night shift or someone on a late shift for these exact reasons. So you wouldn't really have a situation like that. So I don't think they'll ask for something like that in an SJT. Okay. Oh, so it's the last slide. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put some more questions in there. So Bruno, does Bristol look heavily upon the UCAT? That's an interesting question, actually. So the year I applied, so I'm in Bristol, the year I applied was 2017 for the 2018 entry. That year, they didn't look at the UCAT that much. It was 50% personal statement, 30% your grades and stuff, and then your grades, work experience, and then 20% UCAT. The year after me, they had 50% UCAT weighting. And I think from the year after me onwards, they've had much more of a weighting on UCAT than they've ever had before. But it's still not as high as some other unis like King's and things like that, where they do have a really high weighting for UCAT. I think Bristol in general really like people who have a good personal statement because they want to know who you are and get to know you better. And they don't place as much weighting on the UCAT in general, when in terms of whether they offer you an interview or not. And that's what's worked well for them. I would double check the university website for medicine because it tells you how much weighting they've placed on the UCAT each year, and Bristol will announce it probably end of August-ish, so you should be able to find out then. Even if your UCAT isn't that great, I would still apply to the ones you like and give yourself an even chance, obviously, of applying to a place which doesn't look at your UCAT as much. But at the same time, I would still apply to the ones you really want to go to, because they don't just look at your UCAT, they do look at other things as well. So just because one part of your application isn't as strong, the other bits could probably pull you up anyway. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Does anyone have any other questions? It can be questions about general UCAT stuff or specific situational judgment stuff, or it could even be about applying to universities. It can be about anything. I'm going to be on the call for until 3. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. If you want to ask about intercalation, feel free to do that as well. I might be able to help. But yeah, if not, feel free to leave and enjoy the rest of your day. So Ashia, do you have any tips for verbal reasoning? Yeah, so I did the verbal reasoning session for the 6-med surgery session a few weeks ago. I think it was last month, end of last month or something like that. The kind of tips I'd offer for that is make sure to, the first thing I'd say is try and identify keywords. Look at the statement, don't try and read the paragraphs. Try and identify the keywords. Good keywords are things like nouns, numbers, because they're easy to spell, acronyms because they're all in capital letters, so they're easy to find in the text. If you usually with the answer is always can't tell, if you're really, really struggling to either find the information in the text, or if the statement is trying to make you make assumptions. You should never be making assumptions in verbal reasoning, because that's usually a can't tell answer. So that's the main thing for verbal reasoning. The other thing is, if you're really struggling with timing for that one, I would say try and practice your speed reading, because that can really help try to scan the text. So yeah, and if you're really struggling still, try and flag the question and come back to it later, because it's always better to come back and look at it with a fresh set of eyes after a few minutes of looking at a different question. So those would be my main tips. The response is supposed to be the only thing to do. I don't know which bit you're referring to. If you could be a bit more specific about your question. Oh, I've got more questions. What do I do for intercalation? So I normally study in Bristol, but I decided to apply externally to Imperial, and I studied medical sciences with endocrinology. So endocrinology is to do with hormones. So that's what I did my intercalation on. I picked that one specifically because it's very, very clinical. I didn't want to do a very sciencey one where you sit in the lab all day. I wanted to see patients, even though I was on my intercalation year, and I wanted to do a clinical project for my dissertation because I just prefer clinical stuff to lectures and things like that. So it worked out well for me. Some of my friends did really sciencey stuff where they were sitting in the lab and like pipetting stuff in, and that just isn't the kind of things I'm interested in. I prefer looking at patients and then like looking at the effects of medications on patients and things like that. So that's why I chose Imperial's ones, because they're quite clinical compared to other intercalations. Do you have any tips for evaluating arguments for the decision-making section? Yeah, so I actually went over this with one of my students who I do one-to-one teaching with. So decision-making with those argument questions, it's very, very similar to the way you'd approach verbal reasoning. So with the statement, so one of the questions will be something like, should all taxpayers do ... And then you have to pick the best argument. I would actually pick keywords in your question and then try and match up those keywords with one of the answers A, B, C, or D. And the one that matches it the best is the right answer usually. And it needs to address, usually the questions, they have two parts to them. And the best answer that you pick is usually the one which addresses both parts of the answer. So that's how I would answer those questions. For unis that don't consider situational judgment, do you do the same exam and they just ignore your score for that section? Yes. I don't know many of the universities which don't consider your SJT. Even if they say they don't, they probably look at the band when they're trying to determine whether or not to give you an interview invitation, only because the situational judgment is the only section which helps them assess your personality. And it's just to see that if you would be a good fit to be a future doctor. And yeah, so they will still look at it to some depth. They might just not be scoring it to the same extent as the other sections, but they will still have a look at it. I think there are a few ones which completely just don't look at it at all, and they just look at your personal statement instead, which is fair enough. But yeah, they would those universities would just ignore your banding for your situational judgment. What's the interview process like? It differs depending on which universities you're applying for. So I applied to Bristol, Cardiff, King's and St George's. Bristol and Cardiff are really similar in their interview styles. So they both had MMIs. Cardiff had 7 stations and Bristol had 9 stations. Bristol was a bit strange because the first station I was sat on, I didn't have an interviewer. I just had a piece of paper and I had a picture given to me, and I had to write like a medical note as if I was a doctor about what the picture showed, and then sign it as a doctor would. And then the second task was to describe another image or something like that. And then similarly in Cardiff, they had one of the MMI questions. They had like 6 or 7 maths questions. They were very similar to the quantitative reasoning section in your UCAT. And they gave me about 7 maths questions to do in like, I think it was 2 minutes or something. And then as soon as the 2 minutes are over, they take away your paper, and then you just sit there for the rest of the 3 minutes, because each station was 5 minutes. And then I had a really weird question in Cardiff, which asked me about, they were asking me something like, so there's going to be an increase in flights by up to 50% by 2050, how is this going to affect the healthcare system? And it's a really weird question because you can say anything as long as you're able to justify what you're saying, and they just wanted to assess your thought process. So yeah, I had a weird question like that. And then with Bristol, we had questions on what holistic medicine is, and they asked us about research and if we read any research lately. So yeah, and then one of the other questions in Bristol was like, there's a Jehovah's Witness, they can't have a blood transfusion, so what would you do instead? And then the interview sort of pushed me to answer and then asked me about synthetic blood products and stuff like that, which I didn't know much about, but I tried my best with my answers. But yeah, they can really vary, but they do ask some strange sort of creative / imagination questions, I guess, just to see what your thinking is like and if you're able to problem solve. I was lucky with my MMIs because with both Bristol and Cardiff, I didn't get role play, but I think last year they did have role play. So it varies year on year. And then with St. George's, you do have role play, and then you have lots of NHS questions, what's currently happening in the NHS, what the core values are. So they expect you to know all that. So it varies. It depends on the uni, but they will give you a hint or an idea of what kind of stations they'll have. So as long as you're well prepared, it should be okay. And then I didn't do any panel interviews because all the unis I applied were MMIs, but panel, it's just your normal questions. So what's your motivation to study medicine, etc. And then they'll ask you a few of those other questions. So it's similar to MMI, but rather than being interviewed by lots of different interviewers, you'll get asked the same questions by just 3 interviewers for the whole 30 minutes. So that's the difference. Do you have any tips for the strongest argument questions? So yeah, I think I just answered that one. Pick keywords just like you would do verbal reasoning, and then try and match it up to the answers. What do you like most about Bristol, your medicine course? How much clinical stuff we get from the first year. I know a lot of universities say that now, like a lot of uni students say they get lots of clinical practice from the first year, but for us, I didn't realize like how soon we'd actually be seeing patients. And from the first week of my timetable from first year, every Thursday we were in GP or we were in hospital and we were speaking to patients. And that's just to build your communication skills so that you're not nervous when you come to third year, where you'll be on the wards Monday to Friday and you're learning on the wards as well. So it's just to train you to get used to that. And then from third year onwards, you're in hospital all the time, and you're in different placements across Bristol. So that's the thing I like most about Bristol, I think. And also they don't, there is competition in terms of like doing well in your year group and things like that, but they don't pressurize students like other universities do. And I think that's actually good because it actually gives you a room for learning rather than just competing with other people. So I actually feel like I learned a lot more than some of my friends who went to other unis where they were more focused on marks rather than the actual learning. So that's why I like Bristol. Next question. So is it possible that a uni rejects a candidate with band 2 and SJT? I can't really answer that question because that depends on how much weighting they put on the SJT. They might reject you for other reasons. They might reject that. I don't know is the answer. So I don't really know what the criteria is because it varies with each university and it varies every year. So I can't really answer that one. How did I prepare for my interviews? Did you watch the news or read books? I didn't read any books because to be honest, I don't like reading nonfiction stuff. So I wasn't interested in that kind of stuff. I know a lot of people did read books like This Is Going to Hurt or The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. If that's something you're interested in, feel free to do that. But to be honest, I knew I wouldn't really be able to talk about it in interviews because I just wasn't interested in it. And it would just be me forcing something that wasn't part of my personality. So I didn't read any books. What I did do was I read a few articles. So I like reading scientific articles, but I was tactical with it. So I looked up University of Bristol medical research. I looked up what they specialize in. And one of the things that they do is heart research because they have the Bristol Heart Institute. So I read up some stuff about the most up-to-date heart research they did in November 2017-ish, which was the time of my interview. And then I tried to read up like what they've done in the past, and that's what I talked about for my research side. Other than that, in terms of general interview prep, I just practiced with family at home. I went to one course, but other than that, it was just mainly what I did was, for questions that I definitely knew that I'll get asked those questions with every single uni, I wrote down bullet points. So why do you want to study medicine? Why do you want to be a doctor? What work experience have you done? What do you do for your hobbies? Or how do you relax? Or how do you maintain a work-life balance? For all of those questions, I planned bullet points, like 3 to 4 bullet points. So then I'd have a structure of how I would answer them. I didn't write everything word for word, because again, that would just sound a bit like you've rehearsed your answer. But I just noted down some bullet points, which I found useful, because then it was easier to remember lots of things. And then for each of my unis, I researched what type of course they have as well. So if when they asked, why do you want to study at Bristol, or why do you want to study at Cardiff, I knew what kind of teaching they offered, so I could talk about that. So that's how I prepared. SJT question responses are the only thing we should consider to answer the question. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Next one. Any other questions at all? Or is everyone happy? No problem. Oh. How did I revise ethics? Ethics is relatively simple. The main things they expect you to know is, it gets a lot more complicated once you get to uni, the medical ethics side of things, but what they expect you to know before you start is the 4 ethical pillars. So autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, because those are the 4 pillars that you'll be using to answer your most of your ethical scenario questions in interviews or in situational judgment. And the other thing they want you to know is maintaining confidentiality, when to maintain it, when to break it, and consent, informed consent, and how to gain informed consent. The fact that you need to explain to those patients, they need to be able to retain that information, and they need to be able to repeat back to you to show their understanding before they give consent to a treatment or whatever. And with consent, hand in hand goes competence. So is the patient actually competent enough to say yes or no to a certain treatment? And under competence, some of you might have heard of Gillick competence. So that's when underage, they're between 16 to 18. So they're not really adults, but they're not really children. So are they competent enough to say yes or no to their treatment? So one main sort of ethical scenario that they could give you is contraceptives. So a young girl coming in to ask about contraceptives. So assessing whether she has Gillick competence in order to be able to give her those contraceptives. Those are the main things you need to know. So 4 ethical pillars: confidentiality, competence, and consent. Those are the main things you need to know. Other than that, you don't really need to know much else. How did I revise it? There's SixMed has a good section on ethics, and also Medic Portal has some stuff on it. So if you just go look those up and then try and apply those by trying and finding ethical scenarios online and applying those ethical pillars to it, that should be helpful. Do you know how I can improve my reading speed, especially for VR? It's a bit tricky. So I guess one way to do it is just using the keywords technique that I said. That's probably the best one to go with, especially if your UCAT exam is relatively close. Another thing to do is just, like I said, flag it and come back, because then when you see it after a few minutes of spending time on a different question, you may be able to pick up words that you didn't see beforehand. So those are the main things I can give you in terms of tips. I'll just wait one more minute if there's any more questions. I don't think there are any, but if everyone's happy, you can go off now if you wanted to. Do you have any tips for improving speed and abstract reasoning? Yeah, so with abstract reasoning, the main things to remember are, what do you call it? The main patterns. So Latia, I don't know if you use a certain set of patterns to try and look for in your set A, set B stuff, or if you just sort of try and look look for it without having a sort of structure? Do you use any acronyms to try and find different patterns, or do you just scan for them? And then I can help you. I can never spot patterns. Okay, so one of the tips I can give you for abstract is there's 2 different acronyms you can use. So I'll just type the answer. So you can use SCANS, which stands for shape or size, color, arrangement or angles. And then number, so number of sides, number of angles, number of shapes. And then I think it's size, isn't it? Yeah. So you can use SCANS, or you can use something else, which I'll type it in the chat, called SSSPN, which is what 6med use. So size, shape, shading, position, and number. So if you use it as a structure, and if you look for each pattern, is there a size pattern in this? Is one of the shapes bigger than all of the others? And then if it's no, then move on to the next one and say shape. Is there a certain type of shape in set A versus in set B? And then if that's no, then move on to shading, and then move on to position, and then move on to number. So I'd do sort of a rule of elimination and then go by that. And that's probably a useful way. And every time you find a pattern after you've done that question, if you write it down in a notebook or something, so then you can identify the common types of patterns you get with abstract reasoning, and then you can anticipate those patterns when you're doing your exam. So that's the technique I'd give, and hope that was helpful. No problem. So if there isn't any other questions, I'll probably end the session there, but thank you guys for being really interactive and answering all those questions, and good luck for your SJT. I think next Sunday I'm teaching again, so it will be a personal statement session. So we'll go through like how to write personal statements, and then reviewing like bad versus good personal statements, so you guys get an idea of how to write yours. So we'll go through those next week. But yeah, thanks for coming, and thanks for participating with all my questions as well. But enjoy the rest of your Sunday.